Now, I know at Plymouth you've been following the Old Testament readings this summer, and so you don't realize the shift that has happened in the common lectionary this morning in regards to the gospel lessons. We have moved from John's gospel, where for the past 6 weeks, 71 verses about bread. And then now we've moved to Mark's gospel, where in 8 verses, he has shared 2 distinct stories. And because in all my years of preaching, I have yet to have someone at the end of the service shake my hand and say, "Good sermon, Pastor, but it could have been a little bit longer." I'm going to try to take my cue from Mark and not try to do it all. So this morning, I want us really to just look at that first story, the story of the Syrophoenician woman who comes to Jesus seeking healing for her daughter. So who is this woman we find in our gospel lesson this morning? She's important enough that her story also shows up in the gospel according to Matthew, and yet we never know her name. So let's take a moment, if we can. Take a moment to think about her, to wonder about her. We know that she was a Gentile, a non-Jew, and she must have heard the stories of Jesus, the miraculous healings that he had been doing, or she wouldn't have come to him in her time of need. Have you ever stopped to wonder when she decided to seek out Jesus? Was it when she heard that he was in the region, despite the fact they tried to keep it secret? I can see her, maybe in the early morning, at the well in her village, drawing water and telling the other women that she plans to go and seek him out for the healing of her daughter. And did they laugh at her and say, "Come on, you know that he is only doing healings and preaching to the Jews. You're a Gentile. He's not going to see you." In my mind, I think she caught up with him in the late afternoon after having just missed him in town earlier. I can see her with dusty feet and maybe a plain face, neither young, neither old, and I wonder why her husband isn't mentioned. Was she a widow trying to make ends meet? Did her husband leave her, unable to deal with the illness of their child? Perhaps he's working that day, or maybe he just can't risk his heart one more time, hoping for a cure. I can see that she might have come to the house, and I see her bursting through that front door as if she is the embodiment of all her hopes bursting forth. And I can see her with her heart racing and her pulse pounding, and I wonder if it's from embarrassment because she has just barged her way into a house where she was not invited. Or is it pounding from fear that this is her daughter's last hope? Or is it excitement, unshakable belief that today she will see her child well? I can imagine her thinking about those 9 hours of labor to bring her daughter into the world. And did she think about how strong her daughter's grip was, that fist around her finger? And is she remembering all of those nights when she heard those endless wails as her daughter was sick with fever, and how frightening the silence is now when she is too weak to even cry? And I think it is all of that that gave her the strength to barge in through that front door, to push her way through the disciples, to throw herself at Jesus' feet, to humble herself, and to beg this man to heal her daughter. And Jesus looks her in the eye and says, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." In other words, know your place. With her hopes in tatters, I believe that it was more than just a mother's unwavering love, more than sheer audacity born of desperation. It was hope. Hope in the fact that if Jesus is the Messiah, if his followers believe, then they will be just, they will be compassionate. And so she says, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." A banquet or crumbs, a place at the table or begging for leftovers. You know, the last year and a half with COVID and the murder of George Floyd, and the blinders have been ripped from our eyes. We cannot ignore the fact that in this country, with banquet tables overflowing, there are too many who are still told, "Know your place." There are too many who continue to be told, "Be content with the crumbs and the leftovers." There are far too many who have never really been given a place at the table. You know, when I was first asked to preach at Plymouth, I thought this was going to be a sermon about social justice and social reform, because Plymouth is the place where you can preach a sermon like that. But sermons, as any preacher will tell you, cannot be controlled. Like the Holy Spirit contained within them, they often blow in directions that is even surprising to the one preaching. And so this morning, this is not a sermon tackling the social issues of our day. There will be no mention of Afghanistan or other world events, although I hope that we are talking about those in our faith communities. But instead, this morning's sermon has a smaller focus. I want us to look at who we tell know your place a little closer to home, in our own churches. As I read this story from Mark's gospel, what kept niggling at me was an event that happened almost 20 years ago. And with her permission, I want to share it with you this morning. My very first call out of seminary was as an associate pastor of a 1,500-member congregation. And I had been a pastor for a whopping 3 weeks when a Korean woman, who I will call Hyun, asked if she could speak with me after the service. Dun, dun, dun. For pastors, that's usually not a good thing. You see, Hyun attended the 8:30 traditional style service, and it was our smallest service, averaging around 70 in attendance. And she had been attending worship for several years and wanted to be more involved in the church, and had actually volunteered for many things. And she was, allowed or asked to maybe work in the kitchen or help with, the church cleanup days. But when it came to things like serving on a board or committee or being a Sunday school teacher or a confirmation mentor, it seemed like there was always someone else who had more experience or more connections or had been a member longer who was asked. And then finally, before I arrived, she had been asked or allowed to usher at the 8:30 service. And I wonder sometimes if she was asked simply because they didn't have anyone else. It was hard to get ushers for the 8:30 service because of the church's tradition that although the pastors came down the stairs with the offering plates or leaned down the stairs to put them into hands, and the communion trays as well, the tradition was after everything had been passed, the ushers would come back up the stairs and place them directly on the altar. It was difficult for those who were mostly elderly at the 8:30 service to deal with the stairs. And so Hyun, who was in her 30s, ushered every week, and sometimes would bring both offering plates or all the communion trays up the stairs. And I can still see the way she would make her way up, and she would stop at that final row, and she would remove her shoes before walking up the steps. Hyun that morning in my office had her head bent down, and in a quiet voice, she confided in me that some people were upset that she went barefoot in church. They said it wasn't proper, even scandalous, she told me. And in her heavily accented English, she said, I not even know what this word mean. I look it up. The altar, she said, it is holy place. I cannot disrespect God by wearing shoes. It is Korean way of respect. Pastor, I don't know what to do. I can be proper Christian or I can be proper Korean, but I cannot be both. I want to serve my church, but they tell me I do this wrong. And in her quiet words, I heard the pain of not having a place at the table. And I felt my anger rising. This is why people don't feel welcome at church, I fumed to myself. Our rules and our whispers, they drive people out. Tell me who said this, I demanded. I may have been new at this church, but I already had my suspicions who the some people were. I was pretty convinced it was Eleanor and her two cronies. And don't let the fact that they were septuagenarians fool you. They ruled women's fellowship with an iron fist. Just the week before, Eleanor had stood up in a women's fellowship meeting when they were discussing how much flatware to buy as they were buying new flatware for the church. And Eleanor stood up and she said, I will remind you that we are a two-fork church. We do not use the same fork for the salad course and the dinner course, for that is not proper. I looked at Hyun and I said, I will talk to them. I'll be talking to the worship committee too, Hyun. The way they made you feel is not okay. But Hyun shook her head. No, Pastor, it is for me to do. This is my church family. I want to tell them why I do this. And I didn't know it then, but I see it now, that wanting to talk for Hyun, instead of creating a space for her to talk, was my way of saying, be content with the crumbs and not a seat at the banquet table. But luckily, Hyun convinced me that it was right for her to speak. And so the following week at worship, the beginning of the service, there were announcements, and our last announcement of the day was Hyun, who came up that center aisle and removed her shoes and came up to the lectern where the announcements were made. And she shared with her church family how lonely she had been when she first came to this country and how that church was the first place that she felt at home. And she described that after her divorce, she was too sad to go anywhere. But she still came to church, and everyone was so kind. She told them how she loves this country and how proud she is to be an American, if even there, in a little part of her heart, she still is Korean. She described the joy that she feels when she ushers and explained that it was out of love and respect for God and for the church and for everyone gathered that she removes her shoes when she comes to the Holy of Holies. And then she said, I read my Bible every day. I take seriously the words of not being stumbling block to others. And with her voice quavering, she said that she had become aware that her bare feet were a stumbling block for some, and so she needed to explain that it was not out of anger, but out of love, that she would no longer be ushering at the services. And in that suffocating silence, as she slipped on her shoes and made her way back to the back pew, we were all confronted with the fact that our church's table was much too small. For most of us, our churches have been on pause. There has been little, if any, in-person programming. Boards and committees have had to figure out how to meet in different ways. We have been worshiping online or under tents, and we will even be doing it out of love for our children for a while longer. This world is so different, isn't it, from in March of 2020 when we closed the doors and maybe said things like, well, we'll be back in a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two. Or maybe the world is the way it has always been, but we no longer can fool ourselves into believing otherwise. But whichever the case, I know that I, and I think all of us, see the world differently. But the question remains, will we do church differently? Will we be a different church knowing what we have seen? I think that is what Mark's gospel is challenging us this morning, just as he was challenging the early church. He is challenging us to consider who Christ is here for. Is Christ's love for a select few, or is it for everyone? What will we do, having seen the disparities of this world? Will we just throw more crumbs at it? Or are we ready to do the hard work of building a bigger table? I have seen a glimpse of that bigger table. It was the following Sunday. There was Hyeon in her spot in the back pew, her head bowed and well-worn Bible open. It was a communion Sunday, and up front I could see what was going on in the back as we did that familiar liturgy, and I saw Eleanor tap Hyeon on the shoulder, and the two of them have a little conversation. And then, as it came time for the communion elements to be passed, the two women walked forward, and I passed them down into their waiting hands and took my seat. And after the trays had been passed, I watched them make their way up that center aisle and stop at that front pew. And I saw Eleanor take Hyeon's arm and remove her shoes, and then offer her arm to Hyeon so that she might do the same. Two barefoot women made a banquet from the crumbs of the master's table and laid them on the altar. Will we have the courage to do the same? Thanks be to God. Amen.